The sun blazed mercilessly over the dusty main street of Copper Ridge, Arizona Territory, in the summer of 1873. Sheriff Tom Bradley wiped the sweat from his brow as he stepped out of his office, the wooden planks creaking under his boots. The town was quieter than usual, with most folks seeking shelter from the afternoon heat inside the saloon or general store. Bradley had been sheriff for 3 years now, ever since the previous lawman had been gunned down by cattle rustlers. At 32, he was considered young for the position, but his steady hand and fair judgment had earned him respect among the townspeople. Today felt different, though, heavy with intention he could not quite place. A lone figure emerged from the shimmering heat waves at the end of the street. As the man drew closer, Bradley recognized the weathered face of Jake Morrison, a cowboy who worked the Triple Bar Ranch about 15 miles north of town. Morrison's horse moved slowly, its head hanging low from exhaustion. Dust covered both rider and mount from head to toe, suggesting they had ridden hard and fast. Morrison dismounted with obvious fatigue, his legs unsteady as his boots hit the ground. His clothes were torn in several places, and dried blood stained his shirt sleeve. The sheriff immediately approached, concern etched across his features. "Jake, what happened to you?" Bradley asked, noting the wild look in the cowboy's eyes. Morrison glanced nervously up and down the street before speaking in a low, urgent voice. "Sheriff, I need to talk to you. Something terrible has happened at the ranch, and there is more trouble coming to this town than you can imagine." Bradley guided Morrison toward his office, away from the curious stares of a few townspeople who had emerged from nearby buildings. The interior of the jail was cooler, though still stifling. Morrison collapsed into a wooden chair across from the sheriff's desk, accepting a cup of water gratefully. "Take your time." "Jake, tell me what happened," Bradley said, settling into his own chair and leaning forward, attentively. Morrison drained the cup before speaking. "It started 3 days ago when a stranger rode into our ranch, called himself Samuel Hartwell, claimed he was a cattle buyer from back east. Mr. Patterson, our foreman, welcomed him like he was family, said they had done business before." The cowboy paused, running a trembling hand through his hair. But something was not right about this Hartwell fellow. He asked too many questions about the town, about you specifically, Sheriff. Wanted to know about your routines, when you made your rounds, how many deputies you had. Bradley's jaw tightened. Strangers asking about law enforcement usually meant trouble was brewing. What else did he want to know? He was mighty interested in the bank, asked about when they received shipments from the territorial capital. Patterson seemed eager to answer all his questions, which struck me as odd. Our foreman is usually suspicious of outsiders. Morrison shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Yesterday evening, I was checking the horses in the corral when I overheard Hartwell and Patterson talking by the bunkhouse." The cowboy's voice dropped even lower. "Hartwell was giving Patterson money, Sheriff, a lot of money, and Patterson was promising to help with something happening in town tomorrow. They mentioned your name several times, and not in a friendly way." Bradley felt a chill despite the heat. "Did you hear any specifics about what they were planning?" Morrison nodded grimly. "Hartwell said the bank would be easy pickings with the right inside information. Patterson agreed to create a distraction that would draw you and any deputies away from the main street. They were planning to hit the bank during the afternoon, when most folks are indoors avoiding the heat." The sheriff stood and began pacing behind his desk. Patterson had been foreman at the Triple Bar for over 5 years and was well respected in the community. The idea that he might be involved in a bank robbery seemed impossible, yet Morrison had no reason to lie. "There is more, Sheriff," Morrison continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Early this morning I decided to ride to town to warn you, but as I was saddling my horse, I saw Hartwell talking to someone else. Someone I recognized." Bradley stopped pacing and stared at his visitor. "Who?" Morrison met his eyes directly. "Deputy Carson. Your own deputy was meeting secretly with this Hartwell character before dawn. They shook hands, and Carson rode back toward town, while Hartwell headed in the opposite direction." The words hit Bradley like a physical blow. Deputy Frank Carson had been his right-hand man for 2 years. The thought that Carson might be involved in a conspiracy against him and the town was almost too much to process. "Sheriff," Morrison said, standing slowly, "I managed to slip away and ride here to warn you, but I think they saw me leaving. Hartwell might already know I came to town." Bradley walked to the window and peered through the dusty glass at the street outside. Everything appeared normal, but now every shadow seemed to hide potential danger. If Morrison was telling the truth, tomorrow would bring more trouble than Copper Ridge had seen in years. The dusty cowboy had delivered his warning, and now Sheriff Bradley faced the most difficult decision of his career. Could he trust his own deputy? And what should he do about the information Morrison had provided? The next 24 hours would test everything. He believed about justice and loyalty in the harsh frontier territory. Sheriff Bradley spent the remainder of the afternoon wrestling with Morrison's disturbing revelation. As evening approached, he found himself studying Deputy Carson with new eyes, searching for any signs of deception or guilt. Carson went about his usual duties, checking on the jail cells and updating the logbook, appearing completely normal. The deputy was a tall, lean man in his late 20s with sandy brown hair and a mustache that he kept meticulously groomed. He had come to Copper Ridge from Kansas, claiming to have experience as a lawman in cattle towns along the railroad. Bradley had never had reason to question Carson's background or loyalty until now. "Sheriff, you seem troubled this evening," Carson observed as he hung the cell keys on their hook. "Is everything all right?" Bradley forced himself to appear calm. "Just thinking about tomorrow's patrol schedule. I want to make sure we cover the whole town properly." Carson nodded. "I was planning to check the north end of town in the morning, near the church and schoolhouse. There have been reports of vagrants camping in that area." The timing struck Bradley as suspicious. If Carson was indeed working with the bank robbers, suggesting a patrol route away from the main street would fit perfectly with Morrison's story. Yet the deputy's manner seemed genuinely concerned and professional. "Actually, Frank, I think I will handle the North Patrol myself tomorrow. Why do not you stay closer to the center of town, near the bank and general store?" Bradley said, watching carefully for Carson's reaction. A brief flicker of something crossed the deputy's face, perhaps surprise or annoyance, but it passed quickly. "Of course, Sheriff. Whatever you think is best." As Carson prepared to leave for his evening rounds, Bradley made a decision. "Frank, before you go, I want you to know that if anyone approaches you with suspicious offers or tries to involve you in anything questionable, you can come to me, no matter what." Carson paused at the door, his hand on the handle. "That is an odd thing to say, Sheriff. Is there something specific I should be worried about?" "Just general caution. These are dangerous times, and sometimes good men get pulled into bad situations without meaning to." The deputy studied Bradley's face for a long moment. "I appreciate your concern, Sheriff, but I can assure you that my loyalty is to this badge and to this town. Nothing will change that." After Carson left, Bradley locked the office and walked to his small house behind the jail. His mind churned with possibilities and doubts. Morrison had seemed genuinely frightened and had risked his safety to bring the warning. Yet accusing a deputy of conspiracy based on one man's word was a serious matter that could destroy careers and relationships. That night, Bradley barely slept. He lay in his narrow bed, listening to every sound outside his window. Twice he rose to check that his Colt revolver was loaded and ready. The thought that enemies might already be positioning themselves around town kept him on edge until dawn. The next morning brought no relief from the oppressive heat. Bradley arrived at his office before sunrise, hoping to observe the town's early activities. He positioned himself at the window with a cup of coffee, watching as shopkeepers opened their businesses and early risers began their daily routines. Around 7 o'clock, he spotted a familiar figure approaching from the direction of the livery stable. Morrison walked with purpose, but kept glancing over his shoulder nervously. When he reached the sheriff's office, he knocked softly, rather than entering boldly as most visitors did. "Come in, Jake," Bradley called, unlocking the door. Morrison stepped inside quickly and closed the door behind him. "Sheriff, I spent the night at the boarding house, and I've been watching the streets since before dawn. 3 strangers rode into town about an hour ago. They are at the saloon now, but they keep looking toward the bank." Bradley felt his pulse quicken. "Can you describe them?" "2 are rough-looking men, the kind you see in cattle towns. But the third one, Sheriff, he is dressed like a businessman. Clean clothes, polished boots, fancy hat. He could be this Hartwell fellow I told you about." The sheriff moved to the window and peered toward the Silver Dollar Saloon. Even at this early hour, he could see several horses tied to the hitching post outside. "Jake, I need you to do something for me. Can you get a closer look at these men without being obvious about it?" Morrison nodded. "I can walk past the saloon like I'm heading to the general store. What do you want me to look for? See if you recognize any of them from the ranch, and pay attention to whether they seem to be waiting for something or someone." As Morrison prepared to leave on his reconnaissance mission, Deputy Carson arrived for his morning shift. The timing felt uncomfortable to Bradley, who wondered if Carson's arrival was coincidental or planned. "Morning, Sheriff," Carson said cheerfully. Looks like it is going to be another scorching day. Indeed it is, Frank. I was just discussing patrol routes with Mr. Morrison here. Carson glanced at Morrison with what appeared to be casual interest. I do not believe we have met officially. Frank Carson, Deputy Sheriff. Morrison shook the offered hand but remained guarded. Jake Morrison, I work at the Triple Bar Ranch. Ah, yes. I have heard good things about that operation. Fine cattle country up that way. Bradley watched the exchange carefully, noting that Carson seemed genuinely unfamiliar with Morrison. Either the deputy was an excellent actor, or Morrison had been mistaken about seeing Carson meet with Hartwell. After Morrison left to observe the strangers at the saloon, Bradley found himself alone with Carson. The deputy busied himself with routine tasks, but Bradley sensed an underlying tension that had not been present in previous days. Frank, I have been thinking about security arrangements for the bank, Bradley said, testing his deputy's reaction. Mr. Williams mentioned that they are expecting a large deposit from the territorial government this week. Carson looked up sharply. I had not heard about that. When is the deposit supposed to arrive? The question seemed innocent enough, but Bradley noted the immediate interest in Carson's voice. I am not certain of the exact timing. Why do you ask? Just thinking we should increase patrols in that area if there is extra money involved. Word travels fast in small towns, and that kind of information attracts the wrong sort of attention. Bradley nodded, though privately he wondered whether Carson's concern was genuine or whether he was fishing for information to pass along to potential conspirators. The morning was already proving to be full of questions and very few answers. Morrison returned from his surveillance mission within the hour, his face grim with confirmation. He waited until Deputy Carson stepped out to check on a disturbance near the hotel before approaching Sheriff Bradley with his report. It is definitely Hartwell, Morrison whispered urgently. The well-dressed man at the saloon is the same one I saw at the ranch. And Sheriff, there is something else. While I was pretending to browse at the general store, I saw your deputy walk past the saloon. One of the rough-looking men nodded at him, just slightly, but I caught it. Bradley felt his stomach drop. The subtle acknowledgement Morrison described suggested familiarity between Carson and the suspected criminals. Yet he still found it difficult to believe that his trusted deputy could be involved in such a scheme. Jake, I need you to be absolutely certain about what you saw. A man's reputation and career hang in the balance here. Morrison met his eyes steadily. Sheriff, I have been working cattle for 15 years. My life has depended on noticing details that others miss. I am telling you what I saw, and I am certain of it. Before Bradley could respond, Carson returned to the office. The deputy's demeanor seemed more tense than usual, and he kept glancing toward the window that faced the main street. Sheriff, I think we might have trouble brewing, Carson said, attempting to sound casual. There are some strangers in town asking questions about the bank's schedule. Might be worth keeping an extra eye on things today. The comment struck Bradley as particularly suspicious. If Carson was truly concerned about potential bank robbers, why had he not mentioned this earlier? And why was he suddenly so interested in the bank's security after showing little concern about it in the past? What kind of questions were they asking, Frank? Bradley inquired, studying his deputy's reaction carefully. Carson shifted uncomfortably. Oh, just general things. When it opens, when it closes, how much business it usually does. The kind of questions that could be innocent or could mean trouble. Morrison stepped forward. Sheriff, if there are suspicious characters asking about the bank, maybe I should stick around town today instead of heading back to the ranch. An extra pair of eyes might be useful. That is not necessary, Carson said quickly, perhaps too quickly. Sheriff Bradley and I can handle any trouble that comes up. Besides, do not you have cattle to tend to? The exchange confirmed Bradley's growing suspicions. Carson seemed intent on getting Morrison out of town, which made sense if the Cowboy's presence threatened whatever plan was in motion. Actually, Frank, I think Mr. Morrison's offer is a good one. Jake, if you are willing to stay, I could deputize you temporarily. We can use all the help we can get. Carson's face darkened slightly. Sheriff, is that really wise? We do not know anything about this man's qualifications or reliability. Morrison bristled at the insult. I have lived in this territory for 8 years, Deputy. I know how to handle a gun, and I know the difference between right and wrong. That is more qualification than some folks can claim. The tension in the room was becoming palpable. Bradley realized that he needed to make a decision soon, before the situation spiraled out of control. Either Carson was an innocent deputy being unfairly suspected, or he was a dangerous traitor who could not be trusted with sensitive information. Frank, I want you to take the afternoon patrol alone today. Cover the entire town, but pay special attention to the area around the church and schoolhouse. There have been reports of drifters camping in that area. Carson looked confused and slightly annoyed. But Sheriff, if there are suspicious men near the bank, should not I be focusing my attention there? I will handle the bank area myself. That is an order, Deputy. For a moment, Carson looked as though he might argue further. Then he nodded stiffly and gathered his hat and rifle. Very well, Sheriff. I will patrol the north end of town as you requested. After Carson left, Bradley turned to Morrison. Jake, I'm going to trust your judgment, but I need you to understand the seriousness of what we are dealing with. If you are wrong about Carson, we could be destroying an innocent man's life. If you are right, we might be walking into a deadly trap. Morrison nodded solemnly. I understand, Sheriff, but I know what I saw, and my gut tells me that trouble is coming whether we are ready for it or not. Bradley walked to his gun cabinet and removed a spare rifle and ammunition. Then we had better be prepared. I am officially deputizing you as a temporary lawman. Raise your right hand. After a brief swearing-in ceremony, Bradley outlined his plan. We are going to watch the bank from different positions. I will stay inside with Mr. Williams, the bank manager. You position yourself across the street where you can see anyone approaching the front entrance. If shooting starts, do not try to be a hero. Just make sure no innocent people get hurt. As the two men prepared for what might be a violent confrontation, Bradley found himself reflecting on how quickly his orderly world had been turned upside down. Yesterday, he had been a confident sheriff with a trusted deputy. Today, he was preparing to face unknown enemies while wondering if one of his closest allies had betrayed him. The afternoon sun blazed down on Copper Ridge's dusty streets as Bradley and Morrison took their positions. The town appeared deceptively peaceful, with most residents seeking shelter from the heat indoors. But beneath the calm surface, dangerous currents were moving toward an inevitable collision. In the distance, the church bell chimed 2 o'clock, and Bradley noticed several figures emerging from the saloon. The moment of truth was approaching, and soon he would learn whether Morrison's warning had been accurate, or whether they were prepared for a battle that might never come. The clock inside Copper Ridge Bank ticked steadily toward 3 o'clock. As Sheriff Bradley positioned himself behind the teller window, his rifle ready but concealed from view. Bank manager Theodore Williams, a nervous man in his 50s, kept wiping perspiration from his forehead despite the relatively cool interior of the building. Sheriff, are you certain this is necessary? Williams whispered for the third time. Perhaps we should simply close the bank early today and avoid any potential trouble. Bradley shook his head. If we close now, it might tip them off that we know about their plan. Besides, we need to catch them in the act if we are going to have enough evidence for a conviction. Through the front window, Bradley could see Morrison positioned across the street, pretending to repair a broken wagon wheel while keeping watch on the bank's entrance. The temporary deputy had proven himself to be both reliable and observant, qualities that Bradley was beginning to appreciate more with each passing hour. At precisely 3:15, Bradley spotted movement near the saloon. 3 men emerged and began walking casually down the main street toward the bank. The well-dressed man Morrison had identified as Hartwell walked slightly ahead, while his 2 companions flanked him on either side. All 3 wore their gun belts low and tied down in the manner of experienced gunfighters. Mr. Williams, get down behind the counter and stay there no matter what happens, Bradley instructed quietly. The bank manager needed no further encouragement and quickly ducked out of sight. The 3 men paused outside the bank, and Bradley could see them exchanging words. Hartwell appeared to be giving final instructions to his companions before they entered. Then, unexpectedly, a 4th figure appeared from the direction of the church. Deputy Carson approached the group, and Bradley watched in dismay as his suspicions were confirmed. Carson spoke briefly with Hartwell, then pointed toward the sheriff's office and shook his head. The meaning was clear. Carson was informing the robbers that Bradley was not where they expected him to be. The betrayal stung worse than Bradley had anticipated, even though Morrison's warnings had prepared him for this possibility. Hartwell appeared agitated by Carson's report. The gang leader looked up and down the street, clearly trying to decide whether to proceed with the robbery or abort the mission. After a tense moment, greed apparently won out over caution. Hartwell nodded to his men, and all 4 conspirators began moving toward the bank entrance. Bradley took a deep breath and checked his weapons one final time. He carried his trusted Colt revolver on his hip and held a Winchester rifle in his hands. The odds were 4 against 2, but he and Morrison had the advantage of position and preparation. The bank door opened with its familiar squeak, and Hartwell entered first, his hand resting casually on his gun butt. He smiled pleasantly at the apparently empty bank before calling out in a deceptively friendly voice, "Good afternoon. Is anyone here to help a customer conduct some business?" Bradley remained hidden behind the teller cage, waiting for the right moment to reveal himself. He wanted all 4 men inside the building before making his move, to prevent any of them from escaping or taking hostages on the street. "Hello," Hartwell called again, his voice carrying a note of suspicion. "Mr. Williams, are you here?" The bank manager's nerve broke, and he stood up slowly from behind the counter, his hands trembling visibly. "Yes, sir, I am here. How can I help you today?" Hartwell's pleasant facade dropped instantly. "You can help us by opening that safe and putting all the money in these bags." He produced several cloth sacks from his coat, while his companions drew their weapons. "Now see here," Williams stammered. "I cannot simply—" "You can and you will," interrupted one of the gunmen, a scarred man with cold eyes. "Unless you want to join the previous bank managers who thought they could refuse us." It was time to act. Bradley stepped out from behind the teller cage with his rifle raised. "This is Sheriff Bradley. Drop your weapons immediately." The reaction was instantaneous and violent. Hartwell spun toward Bradley's voice while simultaneously drawing his pistol. The 2 gunmen flanked him, began shooting, their bullets splintering the wood around the sheriff's position. Bradley dove for cover behind a heavy desk as gunfire erupted throughout the bank. Through the chaos, Bradley could hear Morrison's rifle booming from across the street. The temporary deputy was shooting through the bank's front window, trying to provide supporting fire. Glass shattered and fell like rain as bullets flew in both directions. Deputy Carson had positioned himself near the bank's rear door, apparently to prevent anyone from escaping in that direction. But as Bradley watched in anger and disappointment, Carson instead began shooting at Morrison's position across the street, trying to eliminate the threat to his criminal partners. "Give it up, Bradley," Hartwell shouted over the gunfire. "You are outnumbered and outgunned." The sheriff responded by putting a rifle bullet through the hat that Hartwell had carelessly exposed above his cover. The bank robber cursed and ducked lower, apparently realizing that Bradley was a more skilled marksman than they had anticipated. Bank manager Williams had wisely crawled behind the safe during the initial exchange of gunfire. The heavy metal structure provided excellent protection, though the poor man looked terrified by the violence erupting in his normally peaceful establishment. As the gunfight continued, Bradley began to worry about ammunition. He had brought extra cartridges, but the 4 outlaws seemed well supplied and showed no signs of surrender. Worse, he could hear shouting from the street, indicating that the gunfire had attracted attention from townspeople who might inadvertently walk into the crossfire. Morrison's rifle fell silent, and Bradley felt a stab of fear that his temporary deputy had been wounded or killed. But then he heard the cowboy's voice calling from outside. "Sheriff, 2 more riders coming in from the north. Looks like reinforcements." The situation was deteriorating rapidly. What had begun as a 4-against-2 fight was about to become 6-against-1 if Morrison was indeed out of action. Bradley realized that desperate measures might be necessary to survive. The next few minutes, Sheriff Bradley's situation appeared, hopeless as the gunfight raged inside Copper Ridge Bank. With Morrison, apparently silenced and reinforcements arriving for the outlaws, Bradley knew he needed to act decisively or risk losing everything he had sworn to protect. Then, unexpectedly, the tide began to turn. The 2 riders Morrison had spotted approaching from the north were not additional criminals, but rather townspeople who had heard the gunfire and come to investigate. Doc Patterson, the town physician, and Samuel Brooks, the blacksmith, had armed themselves and positioned themselves strategically around the bank building. "This is Doc Patterson," came a shout from outside. "We have the bank surrounded. Surrender now and nobody else needs to get hurt." Hartwell's confidence visibly wavered as he realized his escape routes were being cut off. The well-dressed criminal had clearly expected an easy robbery followed by a quick getaway, not a prolonged battle with determined defenders. Deputy Carson, recognizing that his betrayal had been exposed and his situation was becoming untenable, made a desperate decision. Instead of continuing to fight alongside the bank robbers, he suddenly turned his weapon toward Hartwell and his companions. "Drop your guns," Carson shouted to his former allies. "I am still a lawman and I am placing you under arrest." Hartwell spun around in shock and fury. "You treacherous snake." "We had a deal." "The deal is off," Carson replied, though his voice shook with uncertainty. "I never signed up for a shooting war in the middle of town." Bradley watched this development with amazement and suspicion. Was Carson genuinely having second thoughts about his criminal alliance, or was this simply another deception designed to save his own skin? Either way, the deputy's change of allegiance had shifted the odds significantly. One of Hartwell's gunmen, the scarred man who had threatened Williams earlier, refused to accept defeat. He swung his pistol toward Carson and fired, the bullet catching the deputy in the shoulder and spinning him around. Carson dropped his weapon but managed to stay on his feet, clutching his wounded arm. Bradley seized the opportunity created by the confusion among the criminals. He rose from behind his cover and put a rifle bullet through the scarred gunman's chest, dropping him instantly. The remaining outlaw, seeing his companions falling around him, threw down his weapon and raised his hands in surrender. Hartwell, now isolated and facing multiple armed opponents, made one final desperate attempt to salvage his plan. He grabbed bank manager Williams and pressed his pistol to the frightened man's head. "Let me walk out of here, Bradley, or Williams dies," Hartwell snarled. "I will take him with me as far as my horse, then release him unharmed." The sheriff kept his rifle trained on Hartwell while considering his options. Taking hostages was a coward's tactic, but it was also an effective one. Williams was an innocent man who did not deserve to die because of criminal greed and official betrayal. "You know I cannot let you ride away, Hartwell," Bradley said calmly. "Too many people have been hurt already. Release Mr. Williams and surrender peacefully. Not a chance. I would rather die fighting than swing from a rope." The standoff stretched taut with tension. Then Morrison's voice came from the bank's rear entrance, where he had apparently circled around during the confusion of the gunfight. "I have a clear shot at him, Sheriff," Morrison called quietly. "Just keep him talking." Hartwell's eyes darted nervously between Bradley in front of him and the unseen threat behind him. The criminal's grip on Williams tightened, but Bradley could see sweat beading on the man's forehead, despite the cool interior of the bank. "Think about this, Hartwell," Bradley continued, playing for time. "You surrender now and you live to see trial. You keep fighting and you die here today. What is it going to be?" For a moment it seemed as though Hartwell might see reason. His pistol wavered slightly, and his grip on Williams loosened. Then his face hardened with desperate resolve. "I am not going to prison," he declared, beginning to swing his weapon toward Bradley. Morrison's rifle cracked from the rear of the bank, and Hartwell crumpled to the floor, his unfired pistol clattering across the wooden planks. Williams stumbled away from his captor, shaken but unharmed. The gunfight was over. Of the 4 criminals who had entered the bank, 1 was dead, 1 was wounded and captured, and 1 had surrendered. The 4th, Deputy Carson, sat against the wall holding his wounded shoulder, his face a mask of shame and regret. Bradley surveyed the aftermath of the violence that had shattered the afternoon calm of Copper Ridge. Broken glass covered the floor, bullet holes scarred the walls, and the acrid smell of gunpowder hung in the air. But the town's money was safe, and justice had prevailed. Morrison entered through the rear door, his rifle still ready despite the apparent end of hostilities. "Everyone all right in here, Sheriff? We're alive, which is more than I expected a few minutes ago," Bradley replied. "Jake, I owe you a debt I can never repay. If you had not brought me that warning..." Morrison shrugged. "Just did what any decent man would do. Cannot stand by and watch criminals prey on honest folks." Deputy Carson looked up from his position against the wall. "Sheriff, I know there is no excuse for what I did. Hartwell offered me more money than I could make in 10 years as a deputy. I thought it would be easy money, just looking the other way while they robbed the bank. I never intended for anyone to get hurt." Bradley studied his former deputy with a mixture of anger and disappointment. "Intentions do not matter much when bullets start flying, Frank. You betrayed your oath and put innocent lives in danger." "I know. And I will have to live with that for whatever time I have left." Doc Patterson entered the bank to tend to Carson's wound, while Samuel Brooks helped secure the surviving criminals. Other townspeople began gathering outside, drawn by the aftermath of the dramatic events. As the sun began to set over Copper Ridge, Sheriff Bradley reflected on the lessons learned during this harrowing day. A dusty cowboy's warning had prevented a disaster, but it had also revealed how quickly trust could be betrayed, and how thin the line between law and lawlessness truly was in the frontier territories. Morrison would return to his ranch with the thanks of the entire community. While Carson would face trial for his crimes, the town would rebuild and move forward. But the events of this day would long be remembered as the afternoon when justice triumphed over greed and corruption in the Arizona Territory.